You begin noticing that every place carries something invisible inside it. Not fantasy, not imagination, something simpler and more human than that. A room can feel tense before anyone speaks, and another room can feel safe before anything good has happened there. Most people notice this quietly, then move past it because modern thinking trains them to trust visible events more than lingering atmosphere. But atmosphere is not separate from action. Atmosphere is what repeated action becomes over time. A home shaped by constant fear eventually teaches the nervous system to prepare for conflict before conflict appears. A home shaped by honesty and care begins relaxing the body before conversation even starts. What remains inside a space after repeated experience is part of the legacy that space carries forward. You can see this clearly in human relationships. Someone may leave your life years ago, yet certain habits, fears, strengths, or ways of speaking still remain active inside you. This does not always happen because they controlled you. Sometimes it happens because repeated contacts slowly train your perception into certain emotional pathways. The longer a pattern repeats, the more naturally the mind begins expecting it. This is why some people continue affecting others long after communication ends. Influence is not always maintained through force. Often it is maintained through imprint. A parent, teacher, friend, partner, or community may no longer be physically present, but the emotional architecture they help build continues generating reactions automatically. The body remembers what the conscious mind believes it already moved beyond. You may notice something important when you begin watching this carefully. Harmful imprinting is easier to recognize because pain creates stronger contrast. People often notice anxiety left behind by criticism, shame left behind by rejection, or distrust left behind by betrayal. But beneficial imprinting works through the same mechanism. Encouragement leaves residue too. Patience leaves residue too. Calm presence leaves residue too. A single conversation rarely changes a life because most transformation happens through repetition rather than intensity. Human beings are shaped less by isolated moments than by emotional climates repeated consistently across time. This is why environments matter more than motivation. A person can temporarily overcome a harmful environment through effort, but eventually the atmosphere around them begins training perception again. Many people try changing their lives while remaining surrounded by emotional structures that constantly recreate the old version of themselves. Then they wonder why progress collapses. They believe change failed because they lack discipline, when often the deeper issue is that the surrounding field continues reinforcing the previous identity. The nervous system always learns from repetition before it learns from intention. This becomes even more visible when you study groups instead of individuals. Entire communities develop emotional signatures over time. Some communities normalize creativity, honesty, and experimentation. Others normalize suspicion, hostility, performance, or emotional suppression. After enough repetition, members stop noticing the atmosphere because what repeats long enough eventually starts feeling normal. That normalization process is one of the strongest forces shaping human behavior. People adapt to emotional climates the same way eyes adapt to darkness. At first, the environment feels sharp and noticeable. Over time, it simply becomes reality. This is why many people do not realize how exhausted they are until they temporarily enter a healthier environment and feel their body soften without effort. You can also observe the opposite pattern. A person raised inside warmth may enter harsh environments and immediately feel something is wrong, even when nobody openly attacks them. Their system notices the absence of emotional safety because their internal baseline was built differently. Legacy is not only what damaged you, legacy is also what protected you before you even understood protection was occurring. This changes the way you understand responsibility. Most people think responsibility only refers to direct actions, visible decisions, or obvious consequences. But human beings constantly leave smaller traces behind them through tone, pacing, emotional regulation, honesty, and relational consistency. People quietly teach others how reality feels simply through the way they repeatedly exist around them. That realization can feel heavy at first because it reveals how much unconscious influence exists in ordinary life. But if understood properly, it can also become clarifying rather than frightening. You do not need to become perfect to create beneficial imprint. In fact, people often trust imperfect honesty more deeply than polished performance because honesty creates stability while performance creates uncertainty. Children understand this instinctively long before they can explain it intellectually. They watch emotional congruence more than spoken instruction. A parent may teach calm verbally while radiating constant anxiety physically. And the child learns anxiety because repeated atmosphere always outweighs occasional messaging. What is lived consistently becomes more influential than what is explained occasionally. The same principle appears in friendships, partnerships, workplaces, creative communities, and even digital spaces. Over time, every repeated interaction teaches people what emotional state they should expect while entering that environment. Some spaces slowly train defensiveness, others slowly train openness. Some train emotional exhaustion through constant urgency, while others create enough psychological space for deeper thought to emerge naturally. You may notice that truly influential people often affect others without aggressively trying to lead them. Their presence itself becomes stabilizing because their internal patterns remain coherent across time. People feel safer near consistency because the nervous system relaxes when it no longer needs to constantly predict sudden emotional shifts. Reliability becomes a form of invisible architecture. This also explains why certain absences feel larger than others. When someone carried strong emotional coherence, their removal leaves behind a structural gap that others continue sensing long afterward. People sometimes describe this by saying a room feels different after someone leaves. They are often speaking more accurately than they realize. Repeated presence alters relational atmosphere in measurable emotional ways. Once you begin seeing this, the idea of legacy changes completely. Legacy is not only fame, achievement, or public recognition. Much of human legacy lives quietly inside nervous systems, habits, expectations, and emotional reflexes passed between people across years of ordinary interaction. Most imprinting happens invisibly while life appears completely normal on the surface. And this means every environment is always becoming something. Every friendship is training perception in some direction. Every repeated emotional pattern is slowly constructing a future atmosphere that others will eventually inherit without fully understanding where it came from. When you begin watching life through that lens, even ordinary interactions start revealing deeper structures that were already shaping human experience long before anyone stopped to name them. You start realizing that legacy is not built at the moment someone leaves. Legacy is built while they are still present, often through behavior so ordinary that nobody thinks to measure them. The way someone reacts under pressure, the way they listen when another person speaks, the emotional tone they repeat during conflict. All of it slowly teaches others what kind of realities are possible between human beings. Most imprinting happens quietly because the nervous system absorbs patterns before the conscious mind forms conclusions about them. This is why people often underestimate how much they affect others during periods that seem emotionally insignificant. They believe influence only exists during dramatic moments, major lessons, or visible turning points. But human beings are shaped more consistently by repeated emotional texture than by isolated intensity. A thousand small interactions eventually become a psychological environment, And environments train behavior more deeply than occasional inspiration ever can. You can see this clearly in the way emotional expectations form. A person who repeatedly experiences ridicule for vulnerability eventually stops speaking honestly before conscious fear even appears. Their body learns anticipation. The nervous system begins solving problems before situations fully arrive because repeated experience slowly converts reaction into automatic prediction. That predictive process is one of the deepest mechanisms shaping human identity. Most people think they are freely reacting to present circumstances when often they are responding to emotional forecasts created by previous environments. The body quietly prepares for outcomes it has learned to expect. Over time, expectation itself begins influencing perception so strongly that people stop distinguishing between what is happening and what they have been trained to anticipate. This explains why some people enter healthy relationships and still feel unsafe. The danger may no longer exist externally, yet the imprint remains active internally. Their nervous system continues operating according to previous emotional climates because adaptation does not disappear the moment conditions improve. Healing often requires enough repeated safety for the body to slowly revise its predictions about reality itself. You may notice something important here. Real transformation usually feels less dramatic than people expect. Movies and motivational culture teach people to imagine change as a sudden breakthrough moment where everything becomes different instantly. But most sustainable transformation happens through gradual exposure to healthier repetition until the body stops expecting harm automatically. This is why consistency matters more than intensity in almost every area of human development. A single encouraging conversation can create hope, but repeated encouragement begins restructuring self perception. A single calm moment can create temporary relief, but repeated calm presence teaches the nervous system that peace may actually be sustainable. The body trusts patterns more than promises. This is also why emotionally unstable environments create so much hidden exhaustion. When emotional conditions shift unpredictably, the nervous system remains partially activated because it cannot confidently predict what comes next. Hypervigilance becomes adaptation. People living inside chaotic emotional climates often mistake survival strategies for personality traits because they have practiced those strategies for so long. You can even observe this in the pacing of thought itself. Some people think rapidly, not because they are naturally clearer, but because their system became trained to scan constantly for potential danger, judgment, or emotional disruption. Others become emotionally quiet not because they lack depth, but because repeated environments taught them that expression carries risk. Legacy lives inside behavior long after memory loses precise details about where those behaviors began. This changes the way you understand human maturity. Many people define maturity through appearance, intelligence, success, or emotional restraint. But deeper maturity often involves becoming aware of the atmospheres you unconsciously reproduce around others. A person may speak beautifully about compassion while consistently generating anxiety, instability, or emotional pressure everywhere they go. The reverse is also true. Someone may not possess impressive language or intellectual complexity, yet their presence creates steadiness in others almost immediately. People often describe this by saying they feel grounded around certain individuals. What they are really sensing is nervous system coherence. The body recognizes when another person is no longer constantly transmitting fragmentation into the environment around them. This is part of why genuine kindness carries more weight than performance based positivity. Performance attempts to manage appearances. Kindness alters atmosphere. One temporarily changes perception, while the other slowly changes emotional structure itself. Human beings remember how they consistently felt around someone long after they forget most specific conversations. You begin seeing that every repeated interaction either increases contraction or increases spaciousness inside the people involved. Some interactions leave people smaller afterward, more guarded, more performative, more emotionally compressed. Others leave people feeling more coherent, more honest, and less afraid to exist naturally without constant self protection. That difference matters more than most achievements people spend their lives chasing. Many individuals gain status while unintentionally leaving behind exhaustion everywhere they go. Others leave relatively little public recognition, yet generations continue benefiting from the emotional steadiness they modeled consistently within families, friendships, communities, or creative spaces. Influence does not always follow visibility. This also explains why some teachings survive far beyond their original messenger. The ideas alone are not what persist. What survives is the emotional atmosphere carried through the teaching itself. People continue returning to certain voices because something inside the transmission creates clarity, spaciousness, or internal stabilization rather than confusion and emotional fragmentation. You may notice that harmful influence often depends on dependency, while healthy influence gradually restores self trust. One weakens internal stability so control becomes easier. The other strengthens internal coherence so external control becomes less necessary. This is one of the clearest differences between imprint that liberates and imprint that confines. And once you begin recognizing that difference, you start watching environments differently. You stop asking only whether something is entertaining, impressive, or emotionally stimulating. You begin asking what repeated exposure to that atmosphere is slowly teaching the nervous system to become. Because every environment leaves traces behind. And over enough time, those traces stop feeling external and start feeling like identity itself. That realization can feel uncomfortable at first because it reveals how much invisible shaping occurs throughout ordinary life. Yet it also creates a different kind of responsibility, not the exhausting responsibility of trying to control every outcome, but the quieter responsibility of becoming aware of what consistently radiates outward through your repeated way of being. Because long before people remember your conclusions, achievements, or explanations, they will often remember what reality started feeling like around you. You eventually begin noticing that imprint is not only carried through direct interaction. Human beings also inherit emotional architecture indirectly through observation. Children study how adults handle pressure long before they understand the language adults use to explain themselves. Communities absorb the emotional habits of repeated leadership. Entire cultures slowly normalize emotional states that began as survival strategies generations earlier. This is why unresolved fear often disguises itself as tradition. A behavior may continue for decades not because it still serves life, but because enough people adapted to it that it started feeling normal. Over time, adaptation can become so familiar that people stop recognizing its original purpose. They defend inherited emotional patterns without realizing those patterns were originally built around survival, instability, or control. You can see this clearly in environments where exhaustion becomes glorified. People begin treating chronic stress as evidence of importance before collective identity formed around overextension. Rest starts feeling irresponsible. Slowness begins triggering guilt. Presence itself becomes difficult because the nervous system has been trained to associate worth with continuous strain. That training affects perception in ways most people underestimate. A person conditioned to constant urgency may eventually interpret calm environments as unproductive simply because their body no longer recognizes steadiness as emotionally familiar. They may unconsciously create pressure even when pressure is unnecessary. In this way, internal imprint starts generating external reality repeatedly until the pattern becomes visible enough to interrupt consciously. This is one reason self awareness can initially feel destabilizing. The moment people begin observing their inherited reactions clearly, they realize many of their automatic emotional movements were never fully chosen. Certain fears were learned, certain relational expectations were absorbed, certain defensive behaviors were constructed gradually through repetition rather than intentionally created through conscious identity. But recognizing conditioning is not the same as becoming trapped by it. Awareness changes the relationship between impulse and action. Once a person can observe a pattern while it is happening, a small space begins opening between reaction and participation. That space matters because transformation rarely begins by controlling emotion directly. It begins by becoming conscious enough to stop unconsciously feeding the same emotional loops repeatedly. You may notice that emotionally coherent people are not necessarily people who never feel fear, grief, anger, or uncertainty. They are often people who stopped organizing their entire identity around those temporary states. They learned how to experience emotion without automatically building permanent structures around every passing internal storm. This creates a different kind of stability than suppression ever could. Suppression attempts to eliminate discomfort. Coherence learns how to remain internally connected while discomfort moves through the system. One creates emotional pressure beneath the surface while the other gradually increases capacity. This distinction becomes extremely important because many people mistake numbness for peace simply because numbness temporarily reduces emotional intensity. Real peace usually feels more alive than numbness, not less. There is sensitivity inside it, awareness inside it, responsiveness inside it. A coherent person often feels deeply, but their feelings no longer completely dictate the shape of their perception, behavior, or identity in every moment. This changes the atmosphere they generate around others. People stop feeling emotionally managed around them. Conversations become less performative because the environment no longer pressures everyone to maintain constant self protection. The nervous system relaxes when it senses it does not need to monitor every word, posture, or emotional fluctuation to remain accepted. That kind of safety leaves profound imprint because most human beings spend enormous portions of their lives adapting to invisible emotional tension. Many people become so accustomed to guardedness that they no longer realize how much energy continuous self monitoring consumes. When they finally encounter genuine spaciousness, the body often responds before the mind fully understands why the interaction feels different. Sometimes this appears as unexpected emotional release, sometimes as clarity, sometimes as sudden exhaustion after prolonged tension finally begins unwinding. The body has its own language for recognizing safer environments, and much of that language operates beneath conscious thought. Human beings are constantly communicating emotional information through tone, pacing, tension, eye contact, rhythm, and nervous system state, even while saying very little verbally. This is why presence cannot be faked for long. Performance may influence perception temporarily, but sustained interaction eventually reveals underlying emotional structure. Over time, people unconsciously begin sensing whether someone primarily radiates control, fear, steadiness, resentment, openness, insecurity, or groundedness, regardless of how polished their words appear externally. And because this process is continuous, every person is constantly participating in the shaping of collective emotional reality, whether they realize it or not. The atmosphere inside homes affects children. The atmosphere inside friendships affects identity. The atmosphere inside institutions affect entire populations. Emotional climates scale outward through repetition until private behavior becomes cultural texture. That realization reframes responsibility in a much deeper way. Responsibility is not only about dramatic moral decisions during extreme situations. It is also about the repeated emotional states people normalize through everyday interaction. The way someone speaks during stress, the way they treat uncertainty, the way they respond when another person struggles. All of these behaviors quietly train reality around them. You begin understanding why some people continue influencing others long after physical contact ends. Their imprint became internalized as emotional reference. A former teacher, friend, parent, partner, or mentor may still affect how someone interprets challenge years later because repeated interaction shaped emotional expectation deeply enough to persist internally. Human beings carry atmospheres forward inside memory. This is why healing one person often affects more people than anyone initially sees. When someone interrupts inherited fragmentation within themselves, they also reduce the probability of transmitting that fragmentation outward repeatedly into future relationships and environments. Internal coherence changes collective reality through accumulation, not spectacle. Small, stabilized behaviors repeated consistently across time alter emotional ecosystems more than occasional intensity usually does. And once this becomes visible, you start understanding legacy differently. Legacy is not only what someone built, taught, achieved, or accumulated publicly. Legacy is also the emotional architecture they reinforced within the people around them, whether others became more contracted or more alive through repeated contact, whether fear deepened around them or honesty became easier, whether people learned to perform more heavily or breathe more naturally. Because in the end, human beings rarely remember every detail of what was said, but the nervous system remembers environments. It remembers whether it learned vigilance or trust, compression or spaciousness, constant emotional negotiation, or the possibility of simply existing without fear of becoming smaller in another person's presence. And once enough people begin recognizing how deeply those invisible imprints shape the world, a different question slowly begins emerging beneath ordinary life itself.
If this transmission resonated, the spiral continues. You did not arrive here by chance, and you do not leave unchanged. More teachings are unfolding across the Haret library, each one meeting you where you are, not where you think you should be. Follow resonance. The next threshold is already listening.